I had a bit of an exchange on Twitter today with Scott Adams, who we had mentioned on this show a couple episodes ago. I actually gave some credit to Scott, who had kind of at least seemingly partially admitted that he was wrong and that the people who were on the other side of it were turned out to be right. I gave him credit for that. You were a little bit less generous to him, and you made some fair points as well. But I ended up getting into an exchange with him on Twitter, and I do think that these things are. I think especially now, kind of symbolically, as we come to the end of it, it's important and valuable to have some of these exchanges in this world, in this kind of internet personality world. I think me and you have been some of the bigger voices really opposing the government response to COVID from the very beginning. And I think Scott was one of the prominent voices not on that side. I don't know exactly what his position was, which seems to be a sticking point for him. I don't exactly understand that, but I just want to read this exchange and kind of go through it. And because there was a challenge that was issued to me here. So let's see if we can't take up this challenge. So this started as an exchange with other people, and I jumped into it. So first, Scott Adams tweeted, he said, "Today I learned that people who can't tell the difference between my opinions on so-called COVID vaccinations and that of Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro are nonetheless excellent at analyzing the risks of vaccines versus novel viruses. In fact, better than almost all the experts." So that was his original tweet. And Eric John, who's the pizza artist, yes, he's great, and he made me on a pizza, which was pretty cool. I believe the first person ever make me on a pizza. So I will always be grateful to Eric for that. So he responded and said, "I think comic Dave Smith said it best when he explained that when you start from the premise that the government is lying to you, then you require solid proof for everything they do, which in this case never existed." So that was his response. I thought a pretty fair job of summarizing what we were talking about recently. And then Scott responded to him and said, "It's important to ignore half of the risks to get to that opinion." So that's what he responded that. So in other words, you must be ignoring half the risk in order to get to the opinion that you distrust the government as a premise. And
I'd like to see the math on that one. Which half of the risk? Which risk are we like? What are you allocating out here? What would be 50% of that? It just
it's right. Yeah, well, it makes no sense. And so anyway, I wasn't in this thread, but I saw this, and because I was tagged in it, and it was responding to me, and Scott Adams was responding to my argument. So I responded and I said, "That's just not true. Skepticism of government as a starting point doesn't require one to ignore anything. It simply requires that you not ignore the risks of authoritarianism, which far too many people did." And to just be clear on what I'm saying there, it's you could think COVID was an incredibly risky and still be skeptical of government. Like there's nothing in that requires you not to think it's risky. I could think many things are very risky and still be very skeptical of government, still know that these are not honest people, that these are it's essentially a legalized criminal organization. None of those views are in conflict. So no, that's just not true. And there was something kind of slippery about the way Scott Adams responded to me. His response was, which I don't like when people do this, when they just like move the goalposts like this. So he made a claim that is logically not true. I pointed out why it's not true. You could, you know what I mean? Like I could even think that COVID was going to wipe out 50% of the human race and still start from a starting point of being skeptical of government. It's just not true that I have to ignore that. Also, the point you made, why are you assuming that's 50% of the risk? Where'd you get this half number from? I would argue that lockdowns and mandates were way worse than COVID. So whatever. But then he said, so his response to that is he goes, "How did you calculate your risk of long COVID with and without the shot?"
Well, so he's asking, fucking La La Land here. How do I quantify my risk about something that probably doesn't even exist? Yes. Yeah, I guess that's a difficult math equation. You got me.
Yeah, so I responded by
What's the
saying,
risk of the tooth fairy coming back into my house to take more teeth? I don't know. I haven't really sat down and thought about that one either, Scott. Why not that likely to happen?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. Okay. So what I said to him is he asked, how do I calculate? He said, how do you calculate your risk of long COVID with and without the shot? And I responded to him saying, I'm not pretending to have a perfect calculation of something impossible to calculate. I said the chances of me getting, quote, long COVID, unquote, and I put that in quotes for an obvious reason, are incredibly small, and there isn't a shred of evidence that the vax would reduce it. Not sure what point you're making.
If anything,
my response.
The evidence would be, what evidence do you have that there was any utility in taking this, and why? Yeah. And how would you quantify your risk of health concerns 4 years from now from an endless booster regimen that the government's recommending?
Right. I mean, but to say this thing of like, how do you like, first of all, he's asking how you calculate this because obviously it's impossible to calculate this. Right. We don't even exactly understand what long COVID is or if it really exists.
People with depression because of government mandates that change their lifestyles.
Well, like, what percentage of the people who are saying they suffered from long COVID are hypochondriacs, and this is something psychosomatic? Like, we just don't know. And it might be the case that there are some people who really got COVID and then suffered. It certainly is true that there are people who got COVID very bad, who got pneumonia in the wake of COVID, who had lung damage. I mean, that is something that can happen. But what exactly are we considering long COVID? All these things seem to get like mushed together, but the idea of people who just had COVID, and this like had a mild case of COVID and then claim they got long COVID. I mean, how would you even know that was actually from COVID versus some other virus that they got, or versus maybe even a jab that they got? It's just impossible to even get a sense of what the exact odds are, and then know what the odds of that are, and then what the odds are with the vaccine. By the way, if someone could actually define these things down and then have a control group of people who are unvaccinated versus vaccinated, I'd be interested to look at the results of that. But that this is where I got into the territory where I was like, I think Scott's being very dishonest. So his response to this was, he said, you know your odds of long COVID. You will have to teach me how. I was not aware that was possible.
Well, you specifically said you didn't know the odds of it. He's just being a real weaselly cunt, because his move is he wants to pretend like there was never evidence. Like, I really don't understand it. I guess I really got to do my homework and go back and see specifically what he was advocating for in regards to COVID.
It just seems like he's being
about his position that much.
He's being, and neither do I. So it's like, just tell me what you're arguing. He's being intentionally slippery here, because I said, I'm not pretending to have a perfect calculation of something impossible to calculate. The chances of me getting long COVID, in quotes, are incredibly small. So then he says, you know your odds of getting long COVID. You'll have to teach me how. I was not aware that was possible. But this is just like silly trickery. I specifically said I can't calculate exactly what the odds are. I said I know that they're very low. And then he said, oh, so you know your odds. You go, no. There's a very big different, there's two very different claims. One claim is, I know my I can calculate the exact risk of getting long COVID. The other is to say, I know it's very low. Now let's say I have no data on getting struck by lightning. So you'd be like, what are your odds of getting struck by lightning? And I'd go, well, I don't know exactly what the odds are because I don't have the data, but I know they're very low. It would be like, oh, I thought you just said you don't know what the odds are. It's like, well, yes, no, I don't know exactly what the odds are. I do know that they're very low. That very low is also a relative term. You know what I mean? Like, what is very low? If the odds of getting struck by lightning were like 5%, we'd probably consider that very high. But I think it's reasonable to say, yes, the odds of me having severe negative health outcomes from COVID are very low by any reasonable standard. So he's just playing a game here. So at this point, someone sends me a tweet from Scott Adams that he tweeted earlier today, when he said, have I taken the prank far enough yet? And evidently he's talking to a bunch of other people about how that he's like pranking the people who are skeptical of the COVID response or something, or the anti-vaxxers, whatever he might call us. So then I responded to him and I said, hey, Scott, someone just sent me your tweet saying this was a prank. So if your game here is that you're saying things you don't believe, and I'm assuming that you believe them, then you got me. Good one, I guess.